What happens when royalty meets reality television and thinks they can control the conversation? In just 49 seconds, one dismissive comment would turn a simple interview into the most explosive moment in daytime TV history, ending with a prince being thrown off live television by a woman who refuses to bow to anyone. The Loose Women studio buzzed with its usual energy. Janet Street Porter sat at her familiar spot on the panel, her sharp wit ready as always. Beside her, Ruth Langsford adjusted her notes while Colleen Nolan checked her lipstick one last time. Denise Welch tapped her fingers on the desk, and Kay Adams smoothed down her dress. The cameras were rolling, and millions of viewers had just tuned in for what they thought would be another ordinary Wednesday afternoon show. But nothing about this interview would be ordinary. Prince Harry walked onto the set with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. His security team lingered just off camera as he took his seat across from the panel. The studio audience applauded politely, but Janet barely looked up from her cards. Right then, Janet began, her voice cutting through the pleasantries like a knife through butter. Let's get straight to it, shall we? You've been making quite a lot of noise recently about your family, your life, your problems. Some might say you've been whinging a bit, much for someone born with a silver spoon, don't you think? Harry's smile faltered for just a moment. He clearly hadn't expected such a direct opening. I think that's a rather harsh way to put it, Janet. I'm simply trying to tell my truth and help others who might be struggling. Your truth? Janet leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. What makes your truth more important than anyone else's? There are people watching right now who work 3 jobs just to put food on the table, and you're complaining about having to live in a mansion instead of a palace. Ruth Langsford tried to step in with a gentler approach. What Janet means is that people are struggling with real problems right now. How do you connect with ordinary families facing genuine hardship? Harry shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Well, I think everyone can relate to family difficulties. Money doesn't solve everything. You know, mental health affects everyone, regardless of their background. Oh, please, Colleen Nolan interjected, shaking her head. Don't get me wrong, mental health is important, but let's be honest here. Your biggest worry is whether to take the private jet or the helicopter. Most people are choosing between heating and eating. The audience murmured in agreement. Harry's jaw tightened visibly. He wasn't used to being challenged so directly, especially not by a panel of middle-aged women on daytime television. I think you're being incredibly unfair, Harry said, his voice rising slightly. You don't know what I've been through. You have no idea what it's like to live under that kind of scrutiny. Janet let out a sharp laugh. Scrutiny? Love, we're on live television 5 days a week. We know all about scrutiny. The difference is, we don't run away to California and then spend years moaning about how hard our lives are. Denise Welch nodded enthusiastically. Janet's got a point there. When life gets tough for us, we can't just disappear to a beach house and write a tell-all book about our families. That's not fair, Harry protested, his composure beginning to crack. You're deliberately misrepresenting everything I've said and done. Am I? Janet challenged, leaning back in her chair with a smirk. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've spent the last few years throwing your family under the bus while playing the victim. And now you're here trying to get sympathy from hardworking people who would give anything to have your problems. The studio fell silent except for the hum of the cameras. Harry stared at Janet with a mixture of shock and growing anger. He clearly hadn't prepared for this level of direct confrontation. Kay Adams attempted to lighten the mood. Perhaps we could talk about some of the positive work you've been doing. The charity efforts, the mental health advocacy, but Harry was no longer interested in diplomacy. His face had flushed red, and his hands were clenched in his lap. I don't think any of you understand the sacrifices I've made, the things I've given up. Sacrifices? Janet's voice dripped with disbelief. What exactly have you sacrificed? Your royal duties? Most people call that quitting their job. Your relationship with your family? That was your choice, wasn't it? You don't understand, Harry repeated, his voice getting louder. None of you understand what it's like to be born into that world. No, we don't, Colleen agreed. Because most of us were born into council houses and had to work for everything we've got. But we're not sitting here complaining about it on television every 5 minutes. The audience began to applaud, and Harry's face grew even redder. He looked around the studio as if suddenly realizing he was outnumbered and out of his depth. Ruth Langsford tried once more to steer the conversation. I think what we're trying to say is that people want to see solutions, not just problems. What are you actually doing to help? I am helping, Harry snapped. More than any of you realize. But all you want to do is criticize and tear me down. Janet raised an eyebrow. We're asking you direct questions about your public statements and actions. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. Maybe I shouldn't be here at all, Harry muttered under his breath. But the microphones picked it up clearly. The panel exchanged glances. The tension in the studio had become palpable. Even the camera operator seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. Well, Janet said with a dangerous smile, if you don't want to be here, no one's forcing you to stay. Harry's eyes flashed with indignation at Janet's words. The suggestion that he could simply leave clearly struck a nerve deeper than anyone expected. He straightened in his chair, his royal breeding suddenly showing through his carefully cultivated casual demeanor. Excuse me? Harry said, his voice taking on a tone that hadn't been heard since his military days. I think you're forgetting who you're speaking to. The studio went dead quiet. Even the audience stopped their murmuring. Janet's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. Oh, are we playing the royal card now? Janet asked, her voice dripping with mock surprise. How very modern of you. I thought you'd given all that up when you moved to America to become a regular person. Denise Welch couldn't help herself. Well, this is interesting. The man who spent 3 years telling everyone he just wants to be treated normally is now reminding us he's a prince. Harry's face went from red to purple. His carefully constructed public image was crumbling in real time, and he knew it. I didn't mean it like that. Oh, but you did, Colleen Nolan jumped in. We all heard it. The cameras caught it. You just tried to pull rank on a bunch of women who've worked their way up from nothing. Ruth Langsford, ever the professional, tried to salvage the situation. I think what Harry meant was, No, Janet interrupted firmly. Let him speak for himself. He's a grown man, isn't he? Or does he need someone to translate his thoughts for him now? Harry's hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly, his knuckles turned white. I don't need anyone to speak for me. What I need is basic respect, which clearly none of you understand. Respect is earned, love. Janet shot back without missing a beat. You can't demand it just because of who your grandmother was. The audience gasped audibly at Janet's bluntness. Several people in the front row covered their mouths in shock. This was television gold, and everyone knew it. Kay Adams leaned forward cautiously. Perhaps we should take a step back here. This seems to be getting quite heated. No, let's not step back, Harry said, his composure completely shattered now. I came here thinking I'd have an intelligent conversation with professional journalists. Instead, I'm being attacked by a bunch of bitter middle-aged women who are jealous of what I've achieved. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of silence that makes television producers' hearts race and viewers reach for their phones to call their friends. Janet stood up slowly from her chair. Her face had gone completely calm, which anyone who knew her recognized as a very dangerous sign. Bitter, middle-aged women? She repeated, her voice deadly quiet. Jealous of what you've achieved? Janet, Ruth warned softly. But Janet held up a hand to stop her. No, Ruth, let's hear what achievements His Royal Highness thinks we're jealous of. Please enlighten us. What exactly have you achieved that we should be envious of? Harry realized immediately that he'd made a terrible mistake, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. I've served my country in the military. I've raised millions for charity. I've used my platform to help people. Right, Janet nodded slowly. You served in the military, which was admirable, but then you quit when things got difficult. You've raised money for charity, but so have we, and we didn't have the advantage of being born famous. And you've used your platform, mainly to complain about your family and make money from tell-all interviews. Colleen was nodding enthusiastically. And let's not forget, we've all been working in television for decades. We've interviewed prime ministers, celebrities, royalty. We've covered serious news stories and helped raise awareness for important causes. What makes you think we'd be jealous of someone who's famous for being born? Denise couldn't resist adding her own jab. I've been on this panel for years, and I've never once seen someone come on here and be so rude to the hosts. Usually, people show some basic manners. Harry was spiraling now, his media training completely abandoned. You don't understand the pressure I've been under. The constant criticism. The invasion of privacy. Privacy? Janet laughed harshly. You're literally on a television show right now talking about your private life. You wrote a book about your private life. You did a documentary about your private life. If you want privacy, maybe stop talking to every camera you can find. The audience erupted in applause, and Harry looked around the studio with wild eyes. He was clearly realizing that he'd walked into a trap of his own making. This is ridiculous, he muttered, starting to fidget with his microphone. I don't have to sit here and listen to this. No, you don't, Janet agreed pleasantly. The door's right behind you. Ruth tried one last time to be diplomatic. I think we're all getting a bit carried away here. Perhaps we could. But Harry cut her off with a gesture that made everyone in the studio freeze. He actually raised his hand toward Ruth as if to silence her, the way royalty might dismiss a servant. The gesture lasted only a second, but it was caught by every camera in the studio. Janet's eyes went wide with genuine shock. Did you just try to shush Ruth? Even Kay Adams, usually the most reserved member of the panel, looked appalled. That was incredibly rude. Harry seemed to realize what he'd done, but instead of apologizing, he doubled down. I'm trying to make a point, and she keeps interrupting. She's doing her job, Colleen said firmly. This is her show, not yours. Actually, Janet said, standing up fully now, I think we're done here. Janet's declaration that they were done hung in the air like a sword about to fall. The entire studio held its breath as she stood there, staring down at Harry with the kind of look that had made her legendary in British television. What do you mean, done? Harry asked, though his voice had lost all its earlier arrogance and now carried a note of genuine concern. I mean, Janet said slowly, enunciating every word with perfect clarity, that this interview is over. You've shown your true colors, and frankly, they're not very pretty. Harry scrambled to regain control of the situation. You can't just end the interview. I was booked for the full segment. Watch me, Janet replied with ice-cold calm. Ruth Langsford looked between them nervously. Janet, perhaps we should. No, Ruth. Janet cut her off gently but firmly. This man just tried to silence you with a wave of his hand like you were some kind of servant. On your own show. I won't stand for it, and neither should you. The cameras captured every moment as Harry's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, anger, and finally, something approaching panic. He clearly hadn't expected this level of resistance from what he'd probably assumed would be a friendly chat show. This is completely unprofessional, Harry protested, his voice rising. You invited me here, and now you're throwing me out because I defended myself? Colleen Nolan shook her head in disbelief. Defended yourself? You called us bitter and jealous. You tried to pull rank with your royal title. You disrespected Ruth. That's not defending yourself. That's being a complete. Colleen, Denise Welch warned with a grin. We're on live television, right? Colleen nodded. A complete nightmare. The studio audience was completely captivated now. Some were recording on their phones despite the no filming policy. This was television history in the making, and they all knew it. Harry stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the studio floor. Fine, if this is how you treat guests, I don't want to be here anyway. Excellent, Janet said with a satisfied smile. That makes two of us. But as Harry started to walk away from the panel, Janet wasn't finished with him yet. Her voice cut across the studio like a whip. And Harry, she called out, making him stop and turn back. Next time you want to play the victim, maybe don't insult the people you're asking for sympathy. It's not a good look. Harry's face flushed red again. He took a step back toward the panel, his finger pointing accusingly at Janet. You set me up. This whole thing was designed to make me look bad. Oh, love. Janet laughed, and it wasn't a kind sound. You didn't need any help from us to look bad. You managed that all by yourself. Kay Adams, who had been relatively quiet throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. For someone who talks a lot about kindness and compassion, you've shown very little of either today. That's rich, coming from people who've spent the last 20 minutes attacking me. Harry shot back. We asked you questions, Ruth said firmly, finally finding her voice after being dismissed. That's what journalists do. If you can't handle questions, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. The audience burst into applause at Ruth's words, and Harry looked around the studio with genuine bewilderment. This was clearly not how these things usually went for him. Security? Janet called out calmly. Could you please escort our guest to the exit? Harry's eyes widened in shock. You're having me removed by security? This is insane. No, Janet corrected him. This is consequences. Something you might not be familiar with, given your background. 2 security guards appeared at the edge of the set. They weren't aggressive or threatening, just professional and ready to do their job if needed. This won't look good for you, Harry warned, his voice taking on a desperate edge. Throwing out a member of the royal family on live television. The press will have a field day. Denise Welch couldn't help but laugh. The press? Love, we are the press. And we're already having a field day. Janet stepped closer to Harry, her voice dropping to a level that only the studio microphones could pick up. Let me make something very clear to you. I've been in this business for over 40 years. I've interviewed everyone from politicians to pop stars to, yes, even royalty. And in all that time, I've never met anyone so entitled, so rude, and so completely lacking in self-awareness as you've been today. Harry opened his mouth to respond, But Janet held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not finished," she continued relentlessly. "You came here thinking you could charm a bunch of daytime TV hosts into giving you an easy ride. You thought we'd be impressed by your title and grateful for your presence. Instead, you found out that real working women don't bow and scrape just because someone's grandmother wore a crown." The studio was completely silent except for the hum of the cameras and the occasional whispered wow from the audience. "You want to know what your problem is?" Janet asked, though it was clearly rhetorical. "You've never been held accountable for anything in your life. Well, congratulations. Today's your first lesson." Harry looked around the studio one more time, perhaps hoping for some support from somewhere, but found only disapproving faces and shaking heads. "This isn't over," he said weakly, though even he seemed to know how hollow the threat sounded. "Yes, it is," Janet replied with finality. "Security, please show His Royal Highness to the door." As the security guard stepped forward, Harry finally seemed to realize that this was actually happening. His shoulders sagged slightly, and for just a moment, he looked less like an entitled prince and more like a man who just realized he'd made a terrible mistake. But instead of apologizing or showing any humility, he straightened up one last time and delivered his parting shot. "You'll regret this," he said to Janet. Janet smiled, and it was the most genuine expression she'd worn all afternoon. "The only thing I regret," she said as Harry was escorted toward the exit, "is that it took this long." The cameras followed Harry as he walked off the set, his security team hurrying to catch up with him. The studio audience erupted into thunderous applause as the studio doors closed behind him. Janet sat back down at the panel, smoothed her hair, and looked directly into the main camera. "Well," she said with perfect composure, "that was refreshing. After the break, we'll be talking about whether it's ever acceptable to wear socks with sandals. I suspect it'll be a more civilized discussion than what we've just witnessed." The audience laughed and applauded again as the show cut to commercial, and television history was made.